Hi, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to talk about the very influential and important figure, Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy, 1847 to 1910, is probably one of the best known authors of all time. In particular, he is famous for his fictional works of literature, most notably War and Peace and Anna Karenina. These modern classics have been immortalised as amongst the greatest fictions ever written. But this isn't what I'm going to talk about. Instead, I want to talk about the man and what he believed in. Tolstoy experienced all the fame, wealth and adulation you might expect from being such a treasured author. On top of this, he was born into Russian aristocracy, in which he was bestowed substantial wealth and privilege. It may then come as a surprise that upon his death, Tolstoy's coffin procession was followed by thousands of mourning Russian peasants who idolised him as a sage. What brought this about was not an admiration of his great works of fiction, but instead it was motivated by what he stood for. For the final 30 years of his life, he championed the oppressed and wrote powerful works of non-fiction, promoting his moral vision. He took what he wrote so seriously that it led him to abandon his aristocratic title. He rejected all the vanities of his fame, declared his former writings as a matter of public property, and most importantly, he spent a considerable amount of time doing philanthropy. This amounted to setting up orphanages, reforming peasant schools, relief work in the Great Famine of 1891, and actively supporting persecuted minorities. This series of lectures will concern itself with the ideas that Tolstoy put forward in his works of non-fiction, which inspired his own behaviour. It did not only inspire him, for as we shall see, his works proved extremely influential and relevant to our time. During his lifetime, Tolstoy was seen as a controversial figure. He himself experienced police surveillance, and in 1901 he was officially excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church. And it's easy to know why after reading his work. In particular, I read A Confession, What is Religion and What Does It Essentially Consist, Religion and Morality, The Law of Love and the Law of Violence, and finally, The Gospels in Brief. Such works had a profound effect on me. Without going into too much detail, it was specifically Tolstoy's concept of religious faith that has fundamentally changed my philosophical outlook. I consider him one of the greats. Again, without going into too much detail, Tolstoy's moral philosophy is not something which can be understood from an impartial or casual perspective, since he puts forward arguments which directly challenge the reader to ask what motivates their actions. It demands serious reflection. All of this might sound rather fanciful. It must be said that Tolstoy's moral philosophy has been incredibly influential. It has inspired a great number of important people and movements. In particular, Mahatma Gandhi was a devoted disciple of his work, describing himself as a humble follower. This in turn influenced figures like Martin Luther King. For this reason, I don't think Tolstoy's work can be easily dismissed, and it demands serious examination. Before we get going, I feel it's important to address the elephant in the room, namely any discussions concerning God, faith and religion. For starters, it's important to realise that such topics of conversation always mean different things to different people. In full disclosure, I came to Tolstoy's writing as an atheist who was sympathetic to religious ideals, but sceptical of the truth of their claims. However, I was curious and kept an open mind. It would be really disappointing if an author like Tolstoy was disregarded out of hand without engaging with his ideas at all. Such a subject can often be derailed before it's even begun. I am in particular thinking of those who believe that any discussions around religion are inherently pointless or even meaningless. To have such a preconception would be a shame, as there are clearly some really interesting ideas surrounding what Tolstoy had to say. Let's start by considering what his moral philosophy hoped to achieve, in Tolstoy's own words. Quote, "A stupendous idea, to the realisation which I feel capable of dedicating the whole of my life. The idea of founding a new religion corresponding to the present development of mankind. The religion of Christ, purged of dogmas and mysticism. A practical religion, not promising future bliss, but giving bliss on earth." End of quote. If you're willing to join him on his investigation, it will unearth some amazing diverse thoughts and interesting themes. Here are but a few topics which are brought up. The nature of knowledge, the synergy between reason and religious thought, moral philosophy, differentiating between faith and organised religion, social conservatism and Christian anarchism, demands on moral character, distortion of Christ's message. These are but to name a few. Chapter 1. A Confession. Tolstoy's Existential Crisis. In 1879, At the age of 50, Tolstoy wrote a small book simply called A Confession, in which he describes how he recently suffered from an existential crisis. As a person, Tolstoy had always been a driven individual, who was generally healthy in both body and mind. However, within this book, he gives the eventual reasons for his psychological distress, and how he overcame it. His psychological conflict arose around a simple question: how should one live? Or, put another way, why do I live? From first appearances, this may seem like a rather bookish or self-indulgent question, but at its heart it has a very simple idea. How does a person prioritize from all the possible actions they could take? This is a conundrum every person has to solve, whether they are conscious of it or not. Within the book, he gives an autobiographical account of how he answered the question throughout different periods in his life, starting with his early life. As a child, he was brought up practicing Orthodox Christian faith, common in Russia. However, at the age of 18, he lost his religious faith. He ultimately couldn't find it a source of meaning, as it seemed so illogical to him. From then onwards, he began to be motivated not by Christian convictions, but instead a personal faith rooted in self-perfection. He called this a faith in perfection. For at least 8 years of his life, he was motivated by perfecting his reputation and position as a member of the Russian aristocracy. This produced behaviour which was driven by vanity and self-interest, and this was the sole motivating force behind his actions. It led him to commit certain actions he would later be ashamed of, but at the time was respected for. Quote, "I cannot recall those years without horror, loathing and heartache. I killed people in war, summoned others to duels in order to kill them, gambled at cards. I devoured the fruit of the peasants' labour and punished them. I fornicated and practised deceit, lying, thieving, promiscuity of all kinds, drunkenness, violence, murder. There was not a crime I did not commit, and yet I was praised for it, and my contemporaries considered and still consider me a relatively moral man." End of quote. Even though Tolstoy's account is particularly extreme for the modern reader, it's really the natural consequence of anyone who values their own reputation and position over any other demands. At that time in his life, his actions were purely motivated by perfecting his reputation and position within Russian society. It was at the age of 26, after returning from the Crimea War, that Tolstoy began a new venture into professional writing. This led to a change in motivation. He decided to dedicate his life to educating people in what is true and what is important. He called this faith in intellectualism. Tolstoy initially believed that such a pursuit would lead to a more worthy lifestyle. He embedded himself within intellectual circles of his time. However, he soon discovered that the main motivation for himself and others was wealth and privilege. Again, this produced behaviour which was directed by vanity and self-interest. He identified two particular ways this played out. Firstly, intellectual snobbery. These intellectual circles considered themselves superior in comparison to the ordinary people, and therefore revered their own position as an intellectual authority. They were to be listened to, and what they said accepted. Tolstoy noticed, however, that there was no general consensus. The second thing Tolstoy noticed was that these intellectual circles had an inflated sense of infallibility. Tolstoy started to question the exact merit and substance of what was being discussed. He came to discover that such people were not motivated but solely by the pleasure of discovering intellectual truths, but instead individuals were more attracted to particular invested interests which benefited their own intellectual position or career. Overall, Tolstoy was left dissatisfied. In A Life Lived Well, he had discovered that a life of self-perfection or intellectual perfection had proven hollow, for he could not adequately answer the question, how should one live? For Tolstoy, it became unclear how he should live his life. Quote, "I was speaking exactly like a person who was in a boat being carried along by the wind and the waves, and who, when asked the most important and vital question, "Where shall I steer?" avoided answering by saying, "We are being carried somewhere." End of quote. To the cynical reader, such a reflection may seem rather self-indulgent, since people usually live very busy lives in which such self-reflection is seen as a luxury. To his credit, Tolstoy admits that his drive did come back when he began to have a very busy family life, raising and supporting 13 children. In this sense, the question, how should one live their life, became easier for him to answer. Quote, "The only truth, that we must live in order to give ourselves and our families the best possible life." End of quote. Unfortunately, Tolstoy did not reflect for too long on the significance of family life. He only comments that they lived a focused and happy life. However, I feel it's important to unpack how a busy family life could be the remedy to such confusion. But I think it would be a mistake to argue that such a personal exploration is an act of self-indulgence, since it's clearly important to consciously recognise that the family life does provide a meaningful answer to how one should live their lives. It is the recognition that one has to protect and serve others. This can be a life lived without the domination of personal vanity and self-interest. However, as we know, this isn't self-evident and necessarily so. The important point is no matter how busy someone's life could be, it does not negate the individual from asking such significant questions, even though they may have little time, energy, or means to act differently. I believe that Tolstoy wants us to learn that we cannot be impartial to such a self-reflection, since, whether we like it or not, it is a necessary prerequisite to any life lived. Indeed, one problem with such an answer is that it doesn't last forever. Children grow up. This happened to Tolstoy when he was 50 years old. At this age, he had everything which he would associate with a life lived well. He was happily married to his wife, extremely famous for his works of literature, immensely wealthy. He also was in exceptional physical health. But nevertheless, those same philosophical questions which plagued him from his earlier life re-emerged in a more direct and visceral manner. They arrived to him not as intellectual curiosities, but instead he experienced them in moments of bewilderment and feelings of loss and despair. Such feelings gathered pace and momentum, and again he returned to the question, how should one live? His initial reaction was to try and downplay such thoughts. One can either take it for granted that everybody knows that the question doesn't need asking, or assume that there is no meaningful answer to the question and that one should not reflect on the implications. However, Tolstoy could not accept such off-the-cuff answers to such an important question. Quote, "The questions seemed so stupid, simple and childish, but the moment I touched upon them and tried to resolve them, I was immediately convinced, firstly, that they were not childish and stupid questions, but they were the most important and profound questions in life, and secondly, that, however much I thought about them, I could not resolve them." End of quote. It began to dawn on him that the severity and seriousness of his predicament, since he could not establish a clear idea of how he should live his life and what actions he should take, it soon dawned on him that there must really be no meaningful way to answer the question, and that any sort of life lived was meaningless. Within his work, A Confession, he gives a long analogy which describes what he called the evil joke being played upon him. Quote, "There is an old Eastern fable about a traveller who is taken unawares on the steppe by a ferocious wild animal. In order to escape the beast, the traveller hides in an empty well, but at the bottom of the well he sees a dragon with its jaws open, ready to devour him. The poor fellow dares not climb out because he's afraid of being eaten by the rapacious beast. Neither does he dare drop to the bottom of the well for fear of being eaten by the dragon. So he seizes hold of a bush that is growing in the crevices of the well and clings onto it. His arms are growing weak, and he knows that he will soon have to resign himself to the death that awaits him on either side. Yet he still clings on, and while he holds on to the branch, he looks around and sees 2 mice, one black and one white, are steadily working their way around the bush he is hanging from, gnawing away at it. Sooner or later they will eat through it, and the branch will snap. He will fall into the jaws of the dragon. The traveller sees this and knows he will inevitably perish. But while he is still hanging there, he sees some drops of honey on the leaves of the bush, stretches out his tongue and licks them. In the same way I am clinging onto the tree of life, knowing full well that the dragon of death inevitably awaits me, ready to tear me to pieces, and I cannot understand how I have fallen into this torment. And I try licking the honey that once consoled me, but it no longer gives me pleasure. The white mouse and the black mouse, day and night, gnawing at the branch from which I am hanging. I can see the dragon clearly, and that the honey no longer tastes sweet. I can only see one thing, the inescapable dragon and the mouse. I cannot tear my eyes away from them. And this is not a fable, but the truth. The truth is irrefutable and intelligent to everyone. End of quote. Tolstoy gives a very honest and frank account of his psychological state at that time. Quote, "Life had grown hateful to me, and some insuperable force was leading me to seek deliverance from whatever means. I could not say that I wanted to kill myself. The force beckoning me away from life was the more powerful, complete, and overall desire." End of quote. The cynical reader may scoff at a person who has an abundance of time and material comfort to speculate on such questions. It may be seen as rather self-indulgent. However, I don't think Tolstoy would necessarily disagree, since clearly when he had a busy family life, he did not dwell on such questions. But the point must be reiterated that if someone cannot genuinely orient themselves in how they should act, then a meaningful life is impossible. No matter how academic this may seem at first, it is an inevitable consequence of this serious reflection upon such a question. In summary of Chapter 1, the first important point to clarify is that Tolstoy's existential crisis is not the result of some sort of psychological condition that Tolstoy may be suffering from. To believe that would be to blatantly misunderstand what he is saying. Tolstoy is asking a deceptively simple question: how should one live? The next chapter will explore Tolstoy's investigation into such a question in far greater depth. But for the time being, what's important to understand is that if someone cannot answer this question, then an existential crisis is inevitable and even natural. If there is no way of answering such a question, then there is no possibility of a meaningful life, since there's no way of choosing a preference between the multiplicity of different actions which an individual could take in their lives. This leads Tolstoy to his existential crisis, which he beautifully summarizes with the parable of the well. Chapter 2, A Quest for Meaning. Quote, "It is the question without which life is impossible. As I had learnt from experience, why do I live? Why do I wish for anything, or to do anything? Or expressed another way, is there any meaning in my life that will not be annihilated by the inevitable death that awaits me?" End of quote. Thankfully, Tolstoy puts aside his existential dread and tries to remain inquisitive about how such a question could be answered. Quote, "Several times I said to myself, but perhaps I have overlooked something, or failed to understand something. It cannot be that this state of despair is common to all men." End of quote. His initial investigation was to try and find a rational explanation, which he had hitherto come across. He explained how in his past he had taken it for granted that there must be a rational explanation. Quote, "For a long time I cowered before knowledge, and felt that the fact of me receiving no adequate answers to my question was the result of my naivety and the fault of my knowledge." End of quote. He decided that if there is going to be a rational answer to such a question, it is either going to come from science or philosophy. Science, a quest for meaning. Tolstoy's approach is to divide science into two broad fields, namely the soft sciences, psychology, biology, and sociology, and the hard sciences, namely physics, mathematics, and chemistry. The basis of such a division is due to the empirical threshold required in such disciplines. When examining the soft sciences, Tolstoy noticed that such disciplines do in fact recognize such a question. However, any such conclusions they make show, quote, "a startling poverty of thought, extreme lack of clarity, and a completely unjustified pretension to resolve questions beyond their scope." End of quote. Regarding the hard sciences, Tolstoy points out that these disciplines are unable to recognize the question itself. Tolstoy speculates what their answer would be. Quote, "You are that which you call your life, a temporary, incidental accumulation of particles. The mutual interaction and alteration of these particles produces in you something you refer to as your life. This accumulation can only survive for a limited length of time. When the interaction of these particles cease, that which you call your life will cease, bringing an end to all your questions. You are a randomly united lump of something. This lump decomposes, and the fermentation is called your life." End of quote. Needless to say, this is not a credible explanation. Philosophy, a quest for meaning. We would naturally presume that a question like, "Why do I live?" is a matter for philosophy, considering it is a field of human knowledge concerned with principles, values, and inquiries. In general terms, it recognizes such a question, but according to Tolstoy, it fails to provide an adequate answer. Firstly, he points out that they only offer vague answers based on little evidence. But more importantly, philosophies that are derived from fields such as religion, governance, and art are really driven by a self-justifying circular argument. For instance, take governance. According to this field of philosophy, the answer to the question, "Why do I live?" is simple: to act as a functioning citizen. However, clearly this explanation only makes sense with reference to governance, and that such an explanation only seeks to justify the institution of governance itself. It is an incomplete account of what it is to be human. This clearly isn't the sort of answer Tolstoy is looking for. He discovers that it is only in abstract philosophy and metaphysics that the question is proposed in the right manner to encapsulate all aspects of reality. However, there is a catch: the answers they produce are utterly useless. He describes that often what happens is that this simple question is answered by referring to unknowable influences, whether it be substance, ideal, spirit, entity, energy, will, etc. Unfortunately, by its very nature, such an answer loses all bearing with reality. It's fair to ask, what wisdom can be discovered from the incomprehensible? Tolstoy learns that it is only from the greatest philosophers that are able to provide a reasonable answer. He examines the philosophies of Socrates, Schopenhauer, Solomon, and the Buddha, and he realizes they all answer the question in the same way. From Socrates, quote, "The life of the body is evil and a lie, and since the alienation of the life of the body is a blessing, we must long for it." End of quote. From Schopenhauer, quote, "Life is that which it should not be, evil. The transition into nothingness is the only thing sacred in life." End of quote. From Solomon, quote, "Everything in the world is both folly and wisdom, richness and poverty, happiness and grief. All is vanity and emptiness. A man dies and nothing remains. This is absurd." End of quote. From Buddha, quote, "It is impossible to live in the consciousness that suffering, weakening, old age, and death are inevitable. We must free ourselves from life, from all possibilities of life." End of quote. As you can see, all four of these great thinkers only reaffirm Tolstoy's suspicion that there is no real reason for why we live, and that our life is truly meaningless. Tolstoy summarized his feelings at the time. Quote, "I searched for an answer to my questions. In all branches of knowledge acquired by man, I sought long and laboriously. I did not search half-heartedly, or out of idle curiosity, but tormentingly, persistently, day and night, like a dying man seeking salvation, and I found nothing." End of quote. His intellectual quest was over, and in my opinion it is hard not to agree with his prognosis. It is clear that he was not suffering from an idiosyncratic foible. Instead, he was right to conclude, quote, "The meaningless of life is the only indispensable piece of knowledge available to man." End of quote. This was clear to him now. However, he was then struck by a follow-on question. If it has been accepted by the greatest rational philosophers that there is no meaningful way to answer the question, but nevertheless people continue to live as if it does, Tolstoy set out to put this question to others, many of whom shared his social, economic, and intellectual background. Their responses he famously categorizes into four reactions. The first reaction is ignorance. Quote, They see neither the dragon that is waiting for them, nor the mouse that is gnawing away at the branch from which they are clinging, and they are licking the drops of honey, but they only lick them for a while. Something will turn their attention to the dragon and the mouse, and their licking will come to an end. End of quote. Once this fleeting ignorance disappears, there's no going back. The second reaction is to distract oneself with pleasure. Quote, while knowing the hopelessness of life, of enjoying the blessings we have without looking at the dragon or the mouse, and of licking the honey in the best possible way, especially if a lot of it has fallen onto the bush. End of quote. Tolstoy argues that this is the go-to reaction for the majority of people to suppress any existential anxiety. It could be argued that a huge part of our culture is a means of distracting oneself from such difficult questions. There are many elaborate hobbies which are used to preoccupy a person's consciousness to only think of the next gratification. However, all such worldly pleasures are only temporary, and eventually last orders will have to be called. Interesting to note that Tolstoy is quite ruthless when describing those who have adopted this approach, describing them as persons of intellectual short-sightedness and underdeveloped imagination. The third reaction is suicide. Quote, having understood the utter stupidity of the joke being played upon them, and realizing that the blessings of death are far greater than the blessings of the living, and that the best thing of all is not to live, they act accordingly and instantly bring an end to this stupid joke, using available means, a noose round the neck, water, stab in the heart, a train on the railway line. End of quote. It is clear to Tolstoy that this is the only rational response one can take. However, there is one more reaction. The fourth reaction is cowardice. Quote, people belonging to this category know that death is preferable to life, but lacking the strength to act rationally and bring a quick end to the deception by killing themselves, they seem to wait for something. End of quote. This is the category Tolstoy found himself. As a matter of desperation, he clings on for hope for some sort of answer, because deep down he has doubts, even though he has seemed to exhaust all avenues in finding an answer. What caused him to have doubts? Something seemed odd to Tolstoy. Quote, reason is the fruit of life, and yet reason rejects life itself. I felt that something wasn't quite right here. End of quote. He clearly recognises that life intuitively seems to possess meaning, what he describes as the consciousness of life. He recognises that this is of course not limited to him. Millions of ordinary people who have lived long and happy lives must have done so believing that it has meaning, otherwise society would have been impossible. Quote, in my reasoning of life, I could have overlooked the life of humanity that surrounds me on all sides, and that I could have been so ridiculously mistaken as to think that my life and the life of Solomon and Schopenhauer was the true, normal life, whilst the lives of millions was not worthy of attention. End of quote. He decided to investigate how the ordinary Russian peasant would respond to being asked, why do I live? Their response led to an intellectual breakthrough that would define the rest of Tolstoy's life. Tolstoy was no stranger to the ordinary Russian peasant, long holding admiration and love for them. It is necessary to clarify who these people were, as it's important to emphasize that there is a difference between peasants and those who live in poverty. Like those living in poverty, they lived a life of deprivation, owning very little in terms of material wealth. But their situation was worse than this. As peasants, they were essentially enslaved to a life of harsh, agricultural drudgery at the benefit of the Russian aristocracy. As a consequence, much of their lives was predetermined by the obligations they had to fulfill in order to survive. Tolstoy's investigation began by asking the question at hand and trying to understand which of the four categories they fitted into. He assumed that they were too ignorant to contemplate such a question, but he was proven utterly wrong. Not only did they understand the question, but they provided an alternative answer with unparalleled clarity. To the ordinary Russian peasant, life unequivocally had meaning. Their unique response did not fit into any of Tolstoy's four categories. Firstly, they were not too ignorant, but highly attuned to such a question. Secondly, they clearly didn't live a life of Epicurean pleasure. Thirdly, they considered suicide the greatest evil. And fourthly, they were not cowards. The clarity of their answer was the result of their sincere religious faith. Tolstoy could appreciate how religion could provide the answer to such an existential problem. However, he had always rejected the validity of religion. as he describes, quote, "Rational knowledge, as presented by the learned and wise, negates the meaning of life, yet the vast masses, humanity as a whole, recognizes that this meaning lies irrational knowledge, and this irrational knowledge is faith, the very thing I could not help rejecting. This God, one in three, the creation of 6 days, the devils and the angels, and all the rest of that, I could not accept without going mad." End of quote. Tolstoy was trapped in the following dichotomy. Reason is the only way to make sense of the world, but it negates life itself. Faith is the only way to bring meaning to the world, but it negates reason itself. Tolstoy finally proposes an analytical solution which can be rather hard to follow. According to Tolstoy, reason cannot conclusively provide such an answer since it cannot adequately contemplate the question itself. The answer it gives is an automatic response, only making reference to the question itself. Put simply, there is no particular rational argument which establishes that life is meaningless, but only the absence of an answer. He argues that such a rational argument has more in common with mathematics than it does with human affairs. Therefore, rational discourse cannot truly rule out a possible answer to such a question. Tolstoy sets out to investigate the religious convictions of the ordinary Russian peasant. To do this, Tolstoy accepts that he would have to drop his rational guard to truly examine their faith despite how irrational such beliefs may be. The only way he could achieve this was by immersing himself directly within the Russian peasant society and experience their religious customs firsthand. What did he experience when living with the Russian peasants? It is first important to mention that Tolstoy kept a completely open mind, and this allowed him to immerse himself completely within village life, and therefore their religious life. However, Tolstoy soon became annoyed by the levels of superstition he was expected to believe. Of course, he recognized that all religions have elements of superstitious practices, but what made the situation more difficult was that the Russian peasants sincerely believed that all such practices were integral to their lives. In particular, Tolstoy struggled with the concept of communion, the drinking and eating of the body of Christ. As hard as he tried, he could not understand the purpose of such a ritual. What is the purpose of believing that you are eating and drinking the body of Christ? Even as an analogy, it seems very bizarre. Such niggling doubts stopped him from truly immersing himself within peasants' religious habits. He felt like a charlatan and made great effort to appear respectful and avoid confrontation. This was the only part of their village lifestyle he could not completely adopt. In fact, Tolstoy had no problem with the physical demands of being a Russian peasant. He came to appreciate the hard physical labour and the deprived conditions in which they lived. Of course, for the peasants this was very much a condition imposed upon them by their servitude. Tolstoy came to recognise that this simplistic way of life had striking similarities to the anti-materialism lifestyle led by Christ. Tolstoy became convinced that this can't just be a coincidence. He argued that there must be a link between anti-materialism and sincere faith. This led him to a radical conclusion. Quote, "I renounce the life of our class, having recognised that it is not life but only the semblance of life, and that the conditions of luxury in which we live deprive us of the possibility of understanding life." End of quote. As a result, he became heavily critical of organised religions that placed prestige and material wealth over sincere belief. In particular, he had met many supposedly religious men whom were more interested in acquiring wealth rather than acting morally. The religious peasants may have lived in squalor, but at least they took their religious life very seriously. Interestingly, Tolstoy noticed that the sincere religious faith produced a different sort of psychological state. In general, the Russian peasants were psychologically humble and well-balanced. This was in stark contrast to those within Tolstoy's circle who spent much of their lives being idle or dissatisfied with life. It can be said that Tolstoy recognized a new sort of psychological sickness related to modern society, which was unknown to the older and simpler way of life. Tolstoy noticed that this was particularly the case in times of great emotional difficulty. For instance, when someone is on their deathbed, peasants were far more likely to face such a situation with stoicism and acceptance, believing that their death was all part of God's plan. It was obvious to Tolstoy that the peasants possessed a superior spiritual psychology which modern society had failed to emulate. Put simply, their lifestyle was more congenial to living a meaningful life. Although he believed this to be the case, he continued to struggle to immerse himself within the actual religious customs being performed, until finally he gave up in pretending to understand the religious importance and finally concluded that, quote, belief seemed to be comprised of an arbitrary confirmation of various completely unnecessary and irrational propositions that had nothing to do with life. End of quote. Tolstoy came to the conclusion that he could not subjugate his rational intellect for the sake of obscure religious practices. However, he had not yet abandoned his project. He could clearly see that the Russian peasants did ascertain a level of meaning and purpose which could only be explained by their faith. Tolstoy recognized that within the Russian peasants existed an older form of life which had anthropological roots to our ancestors. Even though he doesn't make the comparison, we can understand that those tribes who still exist today are probably the best examples of such a past. From this wider perspective, Tolstoy decides to go back to first principles. Faith is necessary for humanity, but this is a stripped back faith that should just be understood as a broad concept of our ability to live. As Tolstoy explains, quote, faith is the knowledge of the meaning of human life, the consequence of which is that man does not kill himself but lives. Faith is the force of life. If a man lives, then he must believe in something. If he did not believe that there was something he must live for, he would not live. Without faith, it is impossible to live. End of quote. Summary of Chapter 2. It's important to reiterate that Tolstoy's rational investigation into finding the answer to how one should live their life ultimately concludes that life is meaningless. Therefore, the critical question is that since this is the case, how is it that people have avoided the terrible existential crisis which consumed Tolstoy? Famously, as Tolstoy points out, those who rationally understand the problem usually distract themselves by pursuing a life of hedonism. Tolstoy discovers a meaningful answer, however it comes from those who live a life that is pre the development of modern civilization. The Russian peasants unequivocally believe that life is meaningful, and this is because they have sincere religious faith. Tolstoy had long dismissed such a religious answer. However, he came to the realization that a religious answer to such a question was superior. But crucially, this by its very definition doesn't have to conflict with reason. The next chapter will be dedicated to what this may look like. Chapter 3. Tolstoy's Concept of Faith. Tolstoy's concept of faith is novel. This is an incredibly simple and broad understanding of the concept of faith. To choose to live is to have faith. This is therefore an understanding of faith stripped away of all religious conventions, irrational superstitions, and accessible knowledge. What's fascinating about this concept of faith is that it is applicable to anyone regardless if they think of themselves as religious or not. To have faith is to choose to live, and it is as simple as that. But to live is to live in a certain direction. Therefore, faith is the driving force behind the type of life an individual chooses to live. Faith should be understood as the only way for an individual to meaningfully orient themselves in an otherwise meaningless universe. As Tolstoy puts it, quote, faith is man's conscious relationship with the infinite universe, from which he derives guidance for his activities. And to quote Tolstoy again, therefore religion has always been, and cannot cease to be, an essential and indisposable condition of the life of a rational humanity. End of quote. It is from this understanding of faith which Tolstoy builds the rest of his philosophical outlook. But what is crucial to Tolstoy is that such a new understanding of faith is not irrational, since it is a necessary consequence of our choosing to live. Although it may not seem like a radical conclusion, such first principles do have some extremely interesting consequences. Quote, true religion is that relationship in accordance with reason and knowledge which man establishes with the infinite world around him, and which binds his life to that infinity and guides his actions. End of quote. From his personal perspective, it was this new understanding which saved him from his existential paralysis. Quote, everything within me and around me came to light, and the light has not deserted me since. End of quote. The most important characteristic of this understanding of faith was that it produced meaning and purpose, and this passage perfectly articulates this. Quote, indeed, the bird is made in such a way that it can fly, gather food, and build a nest. When I see a bird doing these things, I rejoice. And when they do this, I feel quite sure that they are happy and that their lives are meaningful. What should a man do? He too must work for his existence, just as the animals do, but with a difference that he will perish if he does it alone. For he must work for an existence, not just for himself, but for everyone. And when he does this, I feel quite sure that he is happy and that his life has meaning. End of quote. From this passage, we get a glimmer of what Tolstoy would go on to argue. Since although faith is a very broad concept, Tolstoy would go on to define how faith, a way of orienting someone's actions, is superior when taking into account the existence of others. What he later calls divine faith, but what could be called universal faith. Tolstoy's 3 categories of faith. Tolstoy's concept of faith, of which everyone must have to live, he divides into 3 categories: personal, group, and universal. Personal faith, or what he sometimes calls primitive or even savage. This is the faith in which an individual orients themselves as the centre of everything. As we have already discussed, Tolstoy as a younger man had direct experience of this narcissistic way of living. Such a faith does not necessarily have to harm others, but certainly disregards the need to take them into consideration. He describes it in the following way, quote, "which is nowadays found amongst the people at the very lowest stage of development, consisting in a man regarding himself as a self-motivated being who exists in the world for the purpose of attaining the greatest possible personal well-being, irrespective of the degree of suffering that this may cause to others." End of quote. Group faith. Instead, this faith places a group of people at the centre of everything. For example, the family, tribe, nation, state, ethnicity, or religious cohort. In this case, a person's actions are directed to benefit a particular group of people, including the individuals themselves. Tolstoy claims that this would include many religions, for instance certain understandings of Judaism, with the idea of the chosen people. But it could also include forms of patriotism and even favoritism shown towards one's kin. Universal faith. His final category is what he calls divine or Christian faith. Quote, "Man no longer recognizes the meaning of life in the fulfillment of personal ambitions or the ambitions of any aggregate of people, but solely in the service to the will that created him, as well as the entire universe, for the purpose of achieving not his own aims, but the aims of that will. This relationship to the universe leads to the highest religious teachings known to us." End of quote. This universal understanding of faith places not just the individual or a group, but everyone at the centre of everything. When a person does this, their actions have to take into account the interests of everyone, but most importantly, the improvement of the life of humanity in general. Hence why he believes this produces the highest religious teachings known to us. Tolstoy argues that a certain understanding of Christianity is the greatest expression of this universal faith. It's important to understand how this relates to Christianity. Tolstoy argues that the concept of universal faith is present in Christ's original message within the Gospels. It's important to reiterate that the Gospels are the clearest and most accurate texts we have in understanding Christ's message. For transparency, I've always been rather uninterested in Christianity. It wasn't until I read Tolstoy's The Gospels in Brief that I even gave it much thought. Within this book, Tolstoy removes all the mysticism, miracles, and superstition, thereby leaving a clear account of what Christ actually preached. Personally, the most striking realization was that Jesus never claimed he was the only Son of God, even though this is what he was charged with. Christ clearly argues that we are all the children of God, thereby giving us a clear universal understanding of faith. You can see this universal faith expressed clearly in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Quote, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that have cursed you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that spitefully use you, and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father, which is in heaven." End of quote. Matthew, verse 43. Therefore, the reason Christianity fits so well with Tolstoy's universal faith concept is because within such a religion, every person, regardless of their age, ethnicity, culture, gender, class, is considered a child, or in other words, an equal in the eyes of one God. This is the brotherhood of man, and it stands to reason that you can only love your enemies if you value their worth as being equal to your own. This is what Tolstoy describes as true Christian faith. It must be reiterated that Tolstoy is only talking about his concept of universal faith as it relates to Christ's original and most potent teachings. This philosophical project can have some interesting consequences, especially when considering how it relates to conventional Christianity. What is the impact of such a project? Rational understanding of faith. Tolstoy's investigation was driven by the need for a basis of religious faith without sacrificing his rational faculties. He did this by establishing a meaningful faith based on a stripped-back understanding of Christian thought. There simply isn't any superstition or mysticism surrounding such a faith. Everybody has a faith in order to live, and the most superior version, according to Tolstoy, is universal faith. There is a pressing question which Tolstoy felt necessary to address. Why is it within his stripped-back understanding of Christ's message within the Gospels does he ignore the miracles which are clearly wrote about? The answer to this question is truly fascinating and worth reflecting on. Tolstoy didn't believe that the miracles took place because of course that goes against our scientific understanding of the natural world. He explains that if we know that these miracles didn't take place, then why would anyone have taken any notice of this unremarkable man in Jerusalem? This question may seem odd at first, but there can only be one answer. He is remembered for what he said, and that the miracles clearly didn't take place and didn't affect his message. I found this a very interesting thought experiment. Tolstoy's religious faith doesn't conflict with our rational understanding of the world, unlike conventional Christianity as a whole. There are countless aspects of conventional Christianity which are just plainly irrational. For instance, creation of the world in 6,000 years, story of the Ark, miracles, etc. It is also present in the practice of rituals and other religious customs. Just to take a few: sacraments of baptism, communion, notions of blasphemy, worshipping holy relics, etc. Tolstoy questions what any of these has to do with Christ's original and most potent teachings. Interesting, Tolstoy recognises that religion in general is so associated with this nonsense, it is now considered an integral part of it. Quote, "But that is not religion," says man of today, accustomed as they are to regarding the supernatural, i.e. the absurd, as the main sign of religion. According to their way of seeing things, religion must be ridiculous and incomprehensible. End of quote. Tolstoy makes a damning argument which claims that the acceptance of irrationality within Christianity is not an accident or a coincidence, but something that has been developed purposefully. Put crudely, if you can get someone to suspend their rational capacities, then they are easier to control. He explains, quote, "Bit by bit a person grows accustomed to the fact he cannot trust in his reason, and therefore everything in the world as possible, and in the thing most important to him, his actions, he must not be guided by his reason, but by what others tell him. One can see this terrible distortion of man's spiritual world that inevitably results from such an education, and is supported in adult life by all the techniques of persuasion, which, with the aid of the clergy, are continually exercised on the people." End of quote. Comparison between universal faith and conventional Christianity. Simplicity. The most striking observation to make is how universal faith is immediately simple and easy to understand, which is all in very much keeping with Christ's original message. There are no exceptions, just, quote, "doing to others as you would wish them to do to you." End of quote. Compare this to the many Christian denominations, all with their separate understandings of how someone should live their lives. This can only be explained by deviating away from Christ's original message, all of which makes Christianity an immensely complicated and confusing religion. For instance, certain churches will worship material objects which have nothing to do with Christ's universal message. Non-hierarchical religious knowledge. The simplicity of Tolstoy's concept of universal faith means that it is directly accessible to everyone. There is no special ceremony or hierarchical structure a person has to satisfy or fulfill in order to understand how they should live their lives. In fact, individuals don't even need to be part of a church institution, just as long as they were living by Christ's example. This concept goes in stark contrast to how conventional Christianity understands faith. Christian denominations can be categorized as large-scale hierarchical structures which can view being religious as being part of a membership or a shared identity. Tolstoy describes how the church authority and the clergy can have invested interest in manipulating the message of Christ. After all, Christ directly warned against church authoritarianism. According to Tolstoy, they did this by distancing and distracting the people from the direct teachings of Christ. This can be achieved by exaggerating the idea of an all-powerful interventionist God. The church then required parishioners to blindly obey certain dictates to satisfy a vengeful deity. Finally, the clergy placed itself as the intermediate between the people and God, acting as the ultimate gatekeepers. This then gave the church the infrastructure and divine authority so they could maintain their privilege and power. As Tolstoy explains, quote, "As soon as these propositions are accepted under hypnotic influence, everything said by these intermediates is recognized as the holy truth, and then the chief purpose of the religious perversion is accepted." End of quote. The distortion of true Christian values. So far we have discussed the comparison between universal faith and conventional Christianity, and it should be clear that Tolstoy was very troubled by what he saw as the corruption of Christ's original teachings. Needless to say, his analysis also highlighted the corrosive effects on the values held by such churches and their followers. Quote, "While the majority of people deceived by the doctrines of the church have only a vague understanding of the true meaning of Christ's message, and instead worshipped their former idols, worshipped Christ God, his mother, the saints, bowed to the relics and icons, believed in miracles, the sacrament, the redemption, and the infallibility of the church hierarchy, the pagan structure of the world could be maintained and could satisfy the people." End of quote. Remember, when he says pagan structure of the world, he was referring to a world in which people place their self in the centre, aka to have a personal faith. The internal desire to help the brotherhood of man is ill-informed and unexercised. Broadly, this is one of the consequences that Tolstoy highlights, the degrading of people's understanding of faith. For this reason, Tolstoy points out that the majority of Christians could be identified in two ways: the habitual and the insincere. The habitual Christians. These are those who have been indoctrinated from an early age to believe the account of Christianity as portrayed by the major denominations. Tolstoy describes it as a powerful hypnosis in which individuals are brought up believing in dogmas and superstitions. In particular, this develops a shallow understanding of religious faith in which individuals only act out of fear of not following the dictates of God or the church. He even goes as far as describing it as a slave-like psychological state. Insincere Christians is someone who only pretends to believe in religious teachings in order to follow the established norms. They don't actually believe that the church teachings are relevant or even reliable. They are only often concerned with long-established rituals such as marriages, baptisms, and funerals. Such believers are guided out of a sense of obligation or to achieve some sort of personal gain. Either way, the overall effect on religious belief is that it stifles the possibility of a genuine understanding of Christ's message. Tolstoy describes the effect as a distortion of man's spiritual world, but however benign this may sound, it has devastating consequences for behaviour. Quote, "As long as people do not consider all men as their brothers and do not consider human life as the most sacred thing, then rather to destroy they must consider it the first and foremost duty to support. That is, as long as people do not behave towards one another in a religious manner, they will always ruin one another's lives for the sake of personal gain." End of quote. What particularly troubled Tolstoy was the idea of the complete abandonment of the brotherhood of man, and the idea that it is acceptable to inflict suffering on one another. Many supposed Christians believed that violence was ordinary and even necessary part of life, an eye for an eye, for instance. One of the most striking pieces of evidence which demonstrates the conventional Christian Church's abandonment of Christ's message is the Church's support of violence. In certain circumstances, the violence itself is done in the name of religious superiority, the spread of colonialism and imperialism. At other times, churches had no problem sanctioning warfare. Such events deeply troubled Tolstoy. In particular, he was horrified when the Orthodox Church supported the Russian war effort. As he noted, quote, "During the troubled times that followed the war, I witnessed members of the Church her teachers, monks, and ascetics conducting the killing of helpless, lost youths. As I turned my attention to all that was done by people who professed Christianity, I was horrified." End of quote. For Tolstoy, it was clear what the problem was. Quote, "The reason behind the disastrous condition of the Christian nations is the absence amongst them of a higher understanding of the meaning of life, of a faith common to all, and the guidance of conduct that follows from it." End of quote. Therefore, according to Tolstoy, convention and Christian denominations have been corrupted. Is this really the case? One possible answer is that it hasn't, and Tolstoy has just cherry-picked certain characteristics from Christ's teachings and ignored the very problematic areas he now criticizes. Tolstoy addresses this directly. His rebuff rests on the fact that for 5 centuries after Jesus' death, the early Christians did strictly adhere to his teachings. In fact, prior to Christianity being adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Christian movement organized semi-communist institutions. They completely supported the universal position of promoting love and abstaining from violence. These early Christians took their vows so seriously that when called upon to participate in violent wars, they would abstain and would have likely been put to death. Tolstoy argues that this sincere and correct understanding of Christianity faded in around the 5th century, but he argues that it does continue in passionate individuals. He describes them at length. Quote, "To these religious people who, however perverted a society may be, always guard with their lives the sacred flame of religion, without which humanity could not exist. There are times, such as nowadays, when these people go unnoticed, are despised and scorned by all, and spend their lives in obscurity. However few they are in, however low their social standing, however lacking in education and ability, it is these people who, are sure as the fire that lights the parched steppe, will set alight the whole world, and all the hearts of men who have been dried up by years of irreligious living." End of quote. Why did it fade? Tolstoy argued that it had nothing to do with the validity of such teachings, but instead such a digression is inevitable, as he states, quote, "During certain periods in the existence of all human society, a time has come when religion has strayed away from its basic meaning, and then disgraced further and further until it has lost track of this meaning, and eventually ossifies in the already established forms, at which point it has come to have less and less influence on people's lives." End of quote. He points out how Christianity itself is elastic and changes over time. The Reformation is a good example of this. However, he argues that the very teachings of Christ could not have been accepted. Quote, "The fact that Christian teachings was not adopted in its full meaning was both inevitable and necessary." End of quote. As he explains, quote, "A doctrine that undermined the entire existing order of the world could not have been accepted at the time of its appearance, but could only be accepted in an external, distorted form." End of quote. This point is crucial. The philosophy put forward within the Gospels does directly conflict and undermine the existing order of society. If everyone acted as if the brotherhood of man was important, then there would be inevitable challenges to the existing circumstances. These ideas were very prominent and sacred in the early Christians. However, the message was watered down over time to make it more palatable with the existing order of things. Tolstoy quotes Henry George. Quote, "The Christian revelation was the doctrine stating the equality of man, that God is the Father and all men are brothers. It struck at the core of the monstrous tyranny which inspired the civilized world. It smashed the slave chains and alienated the enormous injustice whereby a small group of people could live in luxury at the expense of the masses, and the ill-treated the so-called working classes. This is why the first Christians were persecuted, and why, once it became clear that they could not be suppressed, the privileged classes adopted it and perverted it. It ceased to be the celebration of the true Christianity of the 5th centuries, and to a significant extent it became the tool of the privileged classes." End of quote. As a side note, Tolstoy never considers the idea that Christ's original teachings were in practice too rigid and uncompromising. Universal faith, by its very nature, is absolutist. A person mustn't act in accordance with any external worldly pleasures or personal gain. A good person must live in poverty and spend every waking minute according to the dictates of universal faith. In reality, it is absurdly dogmatic. Also, how do we resolve conflicting moral duties? For instance, duties of care you may have to your own family and caring for strangers. It is a shame that Tolstoy doesn't explore such ideas. Overall, what is clear to me is that Christ's teachings lay down the ultimate gauntlet in moral philosophy, and it is our response to it which is so important. Perhaps the corruption of Christian values is but a natural reaction to Christ's moral absolutism, to soften his message. What is clear is that it has strayed far from what Christ originally taught. Could Christ's teachings be understood correctly whilst at the same time be achievable and not debilitating? However, what is clear is that Tolstoy believed that Christianity should return to its original message. As a younger man during his military service, he notes in his diary, quote, "A stupendous idea, to the realization of which I feel capable of dedicating the whole of my life. The idea is the founding of a new religion, corresponding to the present development of mankind. The religion of Christ purged of dogmas and mysticism. A practical religion, not comprising of future bliss, but giving bliss on earth." End of quote. Summary of Chapter 3. I found Tolstoy's understanding of faith incredibly profound. It's important to reiterate exactly what he's arguing. Faith should be understood as the only means of orienting oneself within an ultimately meaningless universe. It is only those who find life impossible to live who could describe themselves as having no faith. Therefore, this broad understanding of faith encapsulates everyone who goes about their lives and lives as if it does have meaning. By itself, such a concept of faith seems rather inconsequential or even unremarkable. This is where Tolstoy's moral philosophy becomes really interesting, since it allows us to make value judgments about how people choose to live their lives. From a rather technical perspective, Tolstoy argues that universal faith is the most superior since it encapsulates the whole of humanity, the brotherhood of man. And then Tolstoy makes the compelling argument that this understanding of faith, stripped back of all superstition and mysticism, fits perfectly with Christ's original message as told in the Gospels. From this position, Tolstoy launches a scathing critique of both organised religion and those who claim to be Christian. The corruption of Christ's message may have been inevitable at the time, however, can it ever be adopted in its full understanding? This will be discussed in a future chapter, however the next chapter will discuss those who reject religious thought altogether, the rise of atheism. As you can imagine, Tolstoy had some rather novel things to say on the matter. Chapter 4. Tolstoy's response to atheism. Tolstoy was fully aware that an atheist would likely dismiss his arguments as being irrelevant or not worthy of deep reflection. Putting aside arguments around the existence of God, an atheist would likely criticize many aspects of organized religion. Interestingly, as has already been demonstrated, Tolstoy also ruthlessly critiqued organized religion. For instance, negative effects of blind obedience, sanctioned violence, authoritarianism, anti-rationalism, hypocrisy, and moral degradation. Tolstoy argues that these sorts of criticisms have actually damaged the reputation of conventional Christianity to such an extent that this explains the development of atheism, just as Tolstoy himself turned away from the Russian Orthodox Church as a young man. He recognizes that such a reaction is right, but it is by no means a reason to dismiss religion altogether. He had two very good reasons for this. Firstly, that the conventional Christianity being attacked is not necessarily the purest example and expression of Christ's teachings. Therefore, if an atheist is to write off Christianity without considering this, they are not getting the full picture. The next chapter is dedicated to what Tolstoy believed would happen if we truly adopted Christ's original teachings, and how this would affect the society around us. And secondly, how viable is an atheist's alternative way of understanding our place in the world? Put another way, how would an atheist answer the question, how should one live? Let's consider what this alternative is. Atheism and the rise of scientism. This alternative begins with the idea that all religious thinking is merely a relic from our rudimentary past. Quote, "It is accepted that any kind of religious manifestation amongst people is but the remnant of a spiritual organ belonging to man that was once necessary, but which has now long since lost all meaning and significance, like the fifth toe on a horse." End of quote. What is this idea based upon? It is based upon the idea that religious thought is incompatible with Enlightenment thinking. The methodology is simple. If something cannot be verified by scientific method, it is not to be taken seriously. In one foul swoop, this renders all religion as an outlived error. Quote, "Today we, the enlightened people, are living in a scientific period, a period of positive science, which will replace religion and lead humanity to the heights of development which was unattainable while it was subordinated to superstitious religious teachings." End of quote. This is what Tolstoy called pseudo-enlightenment, but what we would likely call today scientism, the belief that science alone can explain everything. During Tolstoy's day, a perfect exemplar of it was a man called Berthelot. As you can see, Tolstoy completely disagrees. Quote, "It is obvious that the thing that Mr. Berthelot claims will replace religion does not exist. Their assertion is entirely arbitrary and based on a completely unjustified belief in the infallibility of science, a belief quite similar to faith in the infallibility of the Church." End of quote. As he continues to argue, quote, "So too these pseudo-enlightened men of today find themselves under the influence of a false science, which has decided that the main nerve by which humanity has always lived and still lives is no longer necessary and can be replaced by something else." End of quote. This something else is an alternative way of understanding our place in the universe. But as Tolstoy explains, from the strictest scientific perspective, the universe is but a meaningless mass of matter. Quote, "An accidental combination of atoms in which a consciousness has been temporarily ignited, but which is bound to be extinguished forever." End of quote. As Tolstoy has already explained, it would be impossible to live if you truly and sincerely believed in such a statement. There is no possible way an atheist could go about their lives without rejecting such a nihilistic understanding of their place in the universe. Let's suppose an avid supporter of scientism could believe that the world is just inanimate matter that has no meaning. Tolstoy discovers that such an understanding is actually incompatible with scientific progress, for the simple reason that the scientific method cannot distinguish between what should and what shouldn't be investigated. Put simply, in a meaningless universe, everything is of equal scientific pursuit, and this leads to an infinite amount of possible inquiries. Quote, "Science has always been, and always will be, not the study of everything, as scientists naively believe. This is impossible, for there is an incalculable number of objects subject to inquiry, but is merely a study of those things put forward by religion in strict order according to their degree of importance." End of quote. It's important to reiterate that what Tolstoy describes as religion is literally a way someone orients themselves within the universe. What's interesting is that the broad curriculum of science does not take such a proposition seriously, and Tolstoy argues the consequences of this are quite self-evident. He describes how the scientific disciplines can lose their way from the most essential questions and become lost in a multiplicity of secondary questions, which lead to it becoming more complex and developing into a complicated game of human intelligence. Personally, what comes to my mind are aspects of theoretical physics which have nothing to do with the response to the needs of human beings today. In short, scientific progress can lose perspective on what subject matters are important. This is the direct result of underestimating the importance of having a considered religious understanding of our place in the universe. An obvious knee-jerk reaction is to claim that such questions are not a matter for science, but for philosophy. It is exactly this sort of decompartmentalizing of human knowledge which Tolstoy thinks is the problem. Maybe atheism is not based on science, but philosophy. Can this provide an answer to how we should live? Philosophy. Tolstoy undertook a deep investigation into how philosophy could answer this essential question. The problem he faced was that it too failed to present an alternative way of understanding our place within the world. Instead, he explains this only led to further intellectual dead ends. Every single moral philosophy attempts to establish a religious attitude which aims to orient a person within the universe. However, according to Tolstoy, every single one has failed drastically. Evidence of this is the fact that no one uses ethical theories to establish how they should act. For instance, have you ever met someone who actually uses Kantian ethics? Although Tolstoy doesn't go into great detail addressing each of the moral philosophy, he does call out the most famous and prolific, those espoused by Immanuel Kant, Spinoza, Schopenhauer, Hegel, Rousseau, Comte. Tolstoy's critique is broad. They don't orient a person within the universe, and by their very concept they in fact muddy the waters and confuse matters. For instance, equating morality with personal well-being. If any conflicts or contradictions arise, such theories rely on, quote, accumulated abstract conditional concepts one on top of the other, end of quote. Therefore, it should come of no surprise that such ethical systems have not seriously challenged typical religious doctrines. Quote, ethical treatises with no religious basis and lay catechisms are written and taught, and people may well think that humanity is guided by them, but this only appears so because, in reality, people are guided more by the religion they have always had, and still have, whilst these treatises and catechisms counterfeit things that flow automatically from religion. End of quote. And in fact, Tolstoy notes that this is why many moral philosophers end up backtracking to the Christian ethical standard. This is what most famously happened in Immanuel Kant's work. However, according to Tolstoy, this is not necessary, as the Christian ethical standard stands independent of philosophy. Quote, no need for fictitious supports to hold it up. End of quote. However, there is one philosopher Tolstoy pays particular attention to, and that is because his philosophy does not try to intellectualize Christian behaviour, but instead deplores it. The famous atheist Friedrich Nietzsche, who coined the term God is dead, tried such a project. Instead of acknowledging the positive aspects of Christian behaviour, Nietzsche's philosophy argues that meekness, submissiveness, reconciliation, and love are all vices that are destroying humanity. Tolstoy vehemently criticises such a philosophy. Quote, Nietzsche's half-crazed thought presented nothing complete or coherent, but only various drafts of immorality and completely unsubstantiated ideas, was accepted by the leading figures as the final word in philosophical science. End of quote. The Great Delusion and the need for the recognition of faith. As you can see, according to Tolstoy, both science and philosophy failed to provide a rational atheist explanation to the question of how should one live. The idea that this would succeed in abolishing religious faith, Tolstoy describes as the Great Delusion. Quote, a person cannot discover any sort of movement the direction in which he ought to move, and yet every movement is inevitably performed in a certain direction. In just the same way, it is impossible in philosophy and science to use mental effort in determining the direction in which efforts should be made, and yet all mental effort is inevitably performed according to a given direction. End of quote. Tolstoy's point is that to act in a direction is to have faith. He argues that it is superstitious not to acknowledge that one's actions must be oriented in a certain direction, and, more importantly, this essential truth is common to everyone. What should be clear is that it is not a discovery made by academic prowess, but instead gleaned by simple religious contemplation. This not only shows the need for faith, but also how it is immediately accessible. Contrary to what most atheists would believe, there is nothing inherently superstitious about this concept of faith, as he explains. Quote, a religious believer behaves in a certain way not because he believes in things unseen or expects rewards for his conduct, but because once he has defined his position in the world, it is natural for him to act according to this position. End of quote. Another misunderstanding is that atheists believe that morality can exist independent of religion. This, according to Tolstoy, is a simple misunderstanding of the concept of faith. Everyone has faith if they are orienting their actions within the universe. Therefore, atheists themselves will inevitably have a religious faith, so to speak, be it personal or group faith. Tolstoy argues that ignorance of this has resulted in mass confusion and moral degradation. He warns, quote, we must never concoct a so-called secular or semi-religious morality founded on sophism or on nothing at all. End of quote. He believes that such a reactionary replacement of Christian morality has already taken place, and we today can see it prevalent in our society. Why would this lead to moral degradation? This is where in Tolstoy's argument we can describe him as a moralist or even a social conservative, since he launches a scathing attack upon those who have misunderstood or willfully ignored the true concept of faith. Why is Tolstoy so critical of those who clearly act in the world purposefully, but clearly don't derive their actions from a concept of universal faith? It must be noted that this would include both atheists and those who call themselves religious in name only. In the majority of cases, those who act in such a way have no clear understanding, and their behaviour is inevitably guided by personal or group faith, and this leads to the abandonment of the Christian project of the Brotherhood of Man. What has happened is clearly evident by the dominant philosophy of our time. A person's actions are dominated by the influence of what could be described as self-interest, disunity, egoism, vanity, materialism, hedonism, etc. Put simply, the degradation of this universal faith leads to individualism. Although it is rarely acknowledged, it can be summarized in the following way. I perceive the universe, and when I die, the universe dies. Tolstoy describes the ramifications of individualism. Quote, in reply to the question, what must we do? The answer is now put forward straightforwardly as, live as you like, without paying attention to the lives of others. End of quote. It is clear that Tolstoy is extremely troubled by this. Quote, the people of the Christian world live like animals, guided in life by nothing other than personal interest and mutual strife, and with the enmity between these people, who are not guided by some unifying spiritual principle, but by alienated animal instincts, and who use intellectual faculties for their own pleasure, is becoming more and more futile and calamitous. Thus, due to the absence of religion, the people of today have built themselves a very cruel, beastly and immoral life. They have also led their complex, subtle and useless mental activity to such a level of unnecessary intricacy and confusion in order to conceal the evil of their lives, that the majority have entirely lost the capacity of differentiating between good and evil, falsehood and truth. End of quote. What makes the problem even worse is that, quote, people today are so accustomed as a consequence of their irreligious life to establish and secure their existence. They believe this sort of arrangement of life to be normal and the only possible way. So stupefied are they by the hypnotic influence exercised on them. End of quote. Consequence of an underdeveloped religious consciousness. Before considering the ramifications of individualism, it is important to consider the unintended consequences of such a disregard for religious consciousness. Tolstoy argues that this is analogous to a child destroying a watch and then being surprised when it stops working. One of the most powerful repercussions is the general development of feelings of hopelessness. Quote, a dreadful weight of evil hangs over the people of this world and oppresses them. The people standing beneath this weight are becoming more and more crushed by it, and are searching for a means of freeing themselves from it. End of quote. The reason for this is clear. Without an understanding of universal faith, a person becomes confused and even lost in defining their position in the universe, and therefore what actions to take. This is a necessary consequence of an underdeveloped religious consciousness. Quote, but a person without religion, lacking the guiding principles for determining the value of his actions, and yielding to the impulses of his varied and frequent contradictory emotions, involuntarily falls into contradiction. Finding himself in this state, he tries to resolve or hide the contradictions with rationalizations that are variously complicated and skillful, but always dishonest. Thus, while the deliberations of religious people are always simple, uncomplicated and honest, the mental activity of the non-religious people is particularly subtle and extremely complicated and dishonest. End of quote. What Tolstoy is arguing here is that without a clear religious mandate, a person inevitably has many conflicting understandings of how they should live their life. What inevitably happens is that they become mainly motivated by self-interest, spending 99% of their life immersed in what interests them. Often these people think of themselves as good individuals and will try to justify these credentials, or failing this, they will often evade scrutiny by obstructing the idea that they even had a choice. This ultimately accumulates to a life which is inherently dishonest. Acceptance of disunity. One of the most troubling consequences of the development of this personal faith is the acceptance of division and disunity. As Tolstoy states, quote, without faith people can only be guided by self-interest, and men guided only by self-interest cannot do otherwise than deceive or be deceived. End of quote. This sets individuals apart from one another, especially if they are guided by material or future interests. Once this hostile understanding is accepted, the individual is inevitably in direct conflict with others. Quote, people will become more and more convinced that the idea that the law of their life does not lie in love and service to one's neighbour, but in struggling against and devouring one another. End of quote. It becomes assumed that this disunity is inevitable and even desirable. This on one hand justifies the existence of state authority, and on the other, the need for amoral capitalism. It justifies state authority because there's a need for an arbiter to mitigate conflicts between individuals. It also accepts the immoral capitalist behaviour and the inequalities which inevitably develop. Tolstoy explains the consequences. Quote, human life is bound to be irrational and wretched. The longer such an existence continues amongst the people of the Christian world, the more irrational and wretched their lives become. End of quote. Group mentality and violence. Although clearly individuals are not motivated by self-interest, but at times their actions can be motivated by the interests of a group they are part of. Tolstoy would argue that although this is an improvement, it's still nevertheless an inferior substitute to an absence of a fully developed religious consciousness. These can be categorized by what Tolstoy called group faith. Quote, the meaning of your life lies in service to that group of people which you count yourself a member. End of quote. This membership can be based on any characteristic, for example, ethnicity, kinship, nationality, ideology, religion, class, gender, etc. Group faiths, by their very nature, excludes others. At times this may be necessary and relatively benign, for instance, only helping those who are a member of your own church. But as we're fully accustomed to, a dangerous group mentality can develop. If an individual dogmatically believes that the interests of their group are superior or under threat, they will inevitably take actions against the other. Such divisions have led to great conflicts and bloody violence. One of the most blatant examples of this in Tolstoy's day was the problematic nature of nationalism. He was particularly shocked by the levels of cruelty committed by supposedly Christian nations in the quest of expansion and colonization. The acceptance of violence. Tolstoy explains that the acceptance of violence is not just between groups with different interests, but also it permeates every part of society. As he explains, quote, life amongst the Christian nations is now dreadful, particularly on account of the absence of any kind of unifying moral principle, and the irrationality which, despite all the intelligent advances, degrades them to a moral plane beneath the animals, and more especially on account of the complexity of the established lie which hides the people from the misery and cruelty of their lives. The lie supports the cruelty in life, the cruelty demands more and more lies, and, like snowballs, they both grow without restraint. But there is an end to everything, and I believe that the end to this calamitous situation of the nations of the Christian world has now come. End of quote. The calamitous situation is the general acceptance of violence. In particular, he highlights two striking ways in which violence is accepted. Firstly, violence as understood as retribution, and secondly, violence as understood as a means to progress. Violence understood as retribution. It must be noted to the modern reader that Tolstoy was living under a regime which was extremely authoritarian and suspicious of rebellion. As a result, violence was seen as an appropriate way to maintain law and order. Tolstoy was fully aware that much of the legal system was based on retribution, ancient law of an eye for an eye. He gives a picture of what it was like at the time. Quote, for the last year or two there have been shootings and hangings of people ceaselessly. Thousands have been strangled and shot. There are also thousands who have been killed and blown up by revolutionary bombs. End of quote. Tolstoy called such state-sanctioned violence as the establishment of evil. According to Tolstoy, there is no justification for using violence as a punishment. Violence as understood as a means to progress. Tolstoy was also critical of those who made the revolutionary bombs, so to speak. Again, there is no justification for using violence as a means of achieving progress. He called any attempts at a violent revolution, quote, perniciousness of employing violence as a means of uniting people, end of quote. His philosophical writings would later directly inspire non-violent resistant movements, most notably led by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Summary of Chapter 4. Tolstoy agrees with many of the arguments put forward against religion. However, he draws a line that science could ever provide a desirable answer. It is a blatant act of scientism to ever think that the scientific method could answer the question of how should one live. And in a really interesting twist, Tolstoy makes the compelling case that science itself requires a religious point of view. Otherwise, in a meaningless universe, everything is of equal importance and unimportance. So too has moral philosophy failed to provide a credible alternative. It's important to reiterate the point that no rational system has ever seriously challenged long-established Christian ideals. This is because on one hand, Christ has already articulated the clearest expression of religious faith, and on the other that such an understanding does not require a great intellectual analysis, as demonstrated by the sincere faith of the Russian peasants. Nevertheless, the consequence of this has resulted in religious apathy and ultimately moral corruption and the development of inferior religious faiths. What I find so interesting is that these conditions have led to a semi-conscious development of individualism, people becoming consumed with material and future interests. These people believe themselves to be good. However, according to universal faith, I've never personally met a good person. This is not a critique but a sobering realization. Ultimately, individualism and tribalism has developed into the acceptance of disunity and division, manifesting itself in all parts of our personal and cultural lives. The acceptance of this, according to Tolstoy, has shown that man has been led astray. It is for all these reasons that Tolstoy believes that we shouldn't abandon Christianity completely, and he believes that once we realise this, a great awakening will take place, i.e. a fresh understanding of Christ's original teachings of universal faith. The next chapter will consider what he meant by this. Chapter 5. Christ's original message. According to Tolstoy, the only credible and reasonable solution to the question of how one should live is the adoption of Christ's original message as told in the Gospels. As has been explained, Christ's original message has been manipulated and distorted over time. However, his message can never be completely eradicated as it is embedded within the key texts of the Gospels. Tolstoy hoped this message would be rediscovered. Quote, "We should understand Christ's teachings openly and simply, and the horrible deceit in which each and every one of us lives will become clear." End of quote. The message within the Gospels clearly defines man's relationship to the universe and informs how one should live. As has been explained, this is understood as universal faith. Quote, "True religion is the establishment of a relationship between man and the infinite life that surrounds him, and which binds his life to the infinity and guides his actions." End of quote. True religion, that is universal faith, is something that is incredibly easy to understand and seems reasonable. However, in reality it is incredibly easy to pay lip service to such a concept without truly understanding its real-world implications. To understand universal faith is to act in accordance with universal faith. How a person chooses to live their lives must be affected. To help explain, Tolstoy differentiates between external and internal goals, although such a dichotomy could be made between the material and the spiritual, or between the selfish and the selfless. Let's consider external goals. When an individual has no clear religious consciousness, they are inevitably consumed with what Tolstoy called external goals. Put simply, a person's day-to-day actions are motivated by their own material self-interest. When followed unchallenged, individuals become consumed by the vanities of the world around them. Tolstoy is quick to point out that such individuals are never completely content, as their desires and expectations always go unquenched. This ultimately leads to a general state of unhappiness and unfulfillment. Quote, "The external, vain, useless activities based on establishing and adopting the external forms of life shields people from the essential inner activity which alone can improve their lives." End of quote. In contrast, internal goals are motivated by a clear religious understanding. In accordance with universal faith, an individual carries out actions which are in direct response to the needs of those around them. It acts as a powerful inner conviction which inspires direct deeds. However, what is important is that the internal conviction is developed and reflects the true religion of universal faith. Quote, "A better life can only come when the consciousness of man is altered for the better, and therefore those who wish to improve life must direct all their efforts towards changing their own and other people's consciousness." End of quote. Liberation from spiritual neglect. As has already been touched upon, those who are consumed by external goals, or we could say material goals, are inevitably dissatisfied. But Tolstoy wishes to go a lot further and claims that such people are actually enslaved to their material and vain desires. In a rather radical way, this runs completely contrary to how we would normally understand liberty. Normally we would consider someone free when they are able to pursue their own self-interest. No, but according to Tolstoy it is the opposite. Quote, A person only needs to set himself, instead of false external social aim, the one true, irrefutable, and attainable inner aim of life, for all the chains by which he now seems so indissolubly bound will fall apart and he will feel perfectly free. End of quote. Again he reiterates, quote, Christianity in its true meaning, and only this kind of Christianity, free people from the slavery in which they find themselves today. End of quote. Therefore, according to Tolstoy, freedom is not a matter of choice, but instead freedom is the absence of spiritual decay and moral degradation. Freedom, therefore, should be understood as following the demands of universal faith. Proactive religious faith. The most fundamental aspect of universal faith is that when a person immerses themselves on a spiritual level, it demands an incredibly powerful proactive religious faith. The way in which Christ lived his life is testament to this. To live in complete service of others. As has already been discussed in the previous chapter, Christ's original message has been subverted to emphasize mysticism, superstition, blind obedience, discipline, regimented ceremonies, etc. However, by subverting this message, it also decimated the development of sincere religious action, and Tolstoy argued this is one of the greatest inflictions that man suffers from, as he explains, quote, The soul of man is the lamp of God, says a wise Jewish proverb. Man is a weak and miserable creature when God's light is not burning in his soul. But when it burns, and it only burns in the souls enlightened by religion, man becomes the most powerful creature in the world. This is then what religion is and what it essentially consists of. End of quote. Political implications, participation and personal responsibility. To sincerely accept universal faith is to actively engage in the society you are part of. Therefore, apathy is not an option. As we know, Jesus himself was a dogmatic moral absolutist. Tolstoy makes the point that well-cultivated religious convictions are the only way of ascertaining meaningful and lasting change. Tolstoy describes how this invisible sphere of religious consciousness needs to be developed and acted upon, but such a course of moral development takes discipline and self-reflection. He explains that a full understanding of universal faith will have real-world implications that will fundamentally change how society functions, and this is what he nicknamed a Christian humanity. Response to critics of a Christian humanity. For starters, within our secular liberal democracies, such an idea about the essential importance of improving moral character seems overstated or even inappropriate. Such a vision runs completely counter to how generally individuals expect to participate and understand their role within society. Take participation. The vast majority of people do not consider how they can actively engage within society in order to improve it. Instead, they seem satisfied with the estranged administrative mechanisms such as elections, thereby creating an implicit distance between social problems and their sense of obligation. On top of this, Tolstoy points out that it is even the criteria for judging social problems which is incorrect. He argues that we are wrong to view such problems as mechanical faults that just need to be solved. Such an understanding of society always neglects the importance of internal spiritual improvement. To demonstrate his point, let's take a rather benign issue, littering. It is often tempting to claim that such an issue is mainly motivated by the physical conditions in which someone finds themselves. For instance, in this case, there not being enough public bins. But in reality, littering is based on how someone views their relationship to the society they live in. That person may just not care about anything else within society, and that disposing of their litter is of little priority to them. It is in this sense a spiritual problem, and that person will keep on doing it irrespective of the physical conditions which could be deployed. This demonstrates Tolstoy's point that in order to achieve meaningful change, we first need everyone to participate in the task of spiritual improvement. As he states, quote, The superstition prevents genuine progress, chiefly because people, under the pretext of preserving and strengthening or altering and improving social conditions, put all their energy into influencing other people, thus neglecting their own inner task of self-perfection, which alone can enhance a change in the structure of society as a whole. End of quote. Such a radical conclusion has wide ramifications for how we should understand political change. Many might argue that political change only happens when power is exerted. This doesn't have to be sinister. For instance, when one party wins a democratic election, they will impose the idea of how society should function. In such a circumstance, politics is understood as the losers being forced to accept the winner's prerogative. However, Tolstoy points out this doesn't lead to lasting and sincere change. He argues that this can only take place with an inner task of self-perfection. This point is simple but blunt. You cannot force someone to adopt your way of seeing the world. They have to go through an inner realization whereby they can sincerely see the world in a different light. It's easy to see how Tolstoy's moral philosophy inspired some of the greatest non-violent political movements in modern history. Tolstoy argues that failure to understand this simple point leads to the, quote, greatest hindrance to achieving the true well-being of humanity, end quote. And elsewhere he states, quote, it is precisely this that can form the greatest obstacle to society's successful creation of those particular improvements in life appropriate to our time, and to the level of development reached by human consciousness. End quote. Ultimately, Tolstoy is explaining the need for a society in which everyone sincerely and actively aims towards spiritual perfection. Therefore, this isn't a criticism of Christian humanity, but its greatest asset. Tolstoy goes on to explain that once an individual has set himself the task of following universal faith, they are in fact establishing values that go beyond the established social norms and laws. Christian humanity stands on its own philosophical foundations. Quote, a Christian is not bound by civil law because he has no need for it, neither for himself or for others, since he considers human life better provided for by the law of love which he professes. End quote. Unity and non-violence. According to Tolstoy, what is needed is the full acceptance of a Christian humanity and thus establishing a peaceful brotherhood of man. He quotes Mazanai, what we need, what the people need, and what the age demands, in order to find our way out of the murk of egoism, doubt, and negation in which it is immersed, is a faith in which our souls can cease to wander in the pursuit of personal ends and can move forward in unison, recognizing one source, one law, one end. End quote. It's important to note that such a unity must be accepted by everyone by its nature. Tolstoy quotes Pascal, quote, some people seek well-being or happiness in power, others seek it in science or in sensuality. Those who are truly close to bliss realize that it cannot exist in something that only a few, rather than everyone, can possess. They realize that the genuine well-being of man is such that all people can possess it at once, without division and without jealousy. It is such that no one can lose it unless he wants to. End quote. Once we understand this unity, we can act in accordance to it. Such a Christian humanity is best summarized by Christ's teachings of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But it's completely wrong to think of this as a rule of conduct based on quid pro quo. Instead, we should understand that everyone is of equal importance and deserving of basic dignity. However, society is imperfect and suffering is inevitable. A true Christian should be driven to try and rectify such disparities. Tolstoy summarizes such a duty. Quote, he should give up his life to the service of others. It is only religion that can bring about this sort of change in man's relationship to the universe. End quote. Tolstoy argues that such a service to others is incredibly hard to emulate. As has already been demonstrated, rational moral philosophy is littered with examples which have failed to come close. This is because it is fundamentally not a rational matter, but instead a spiritual one. A person may rationally understand that they should help others, but this only pales in comparison to an individual who fundamentally places the needs of others as the same or as more important than their own. This takes a very sophisticated spiritual awareness and understanding. Tolstoy argues that it is only in the service to others that we can have the possibility of improving the overall condition of mankind. It is crystal clear that such a Christian humanity can only be achieved when love is the main driving force behind our actions. Quote, love, true love, love that denies itself and transforms itself to another, is the awakening within oneself of the highest universal principle of life. But it is only love that affords all the happiness it can give when it is simple love, free from anything personal, from the smallest drop of personal bias towards its object. End quote. And this law of love gives clear guidance. Quote, the supreme law of life, the law of love, does not permit violence under any circumstances. End quote. Acts of violence can only be perpetrated when the supreme law of life is violated. Violence requires disunity and division in order to be realized and acted upon. Our history is full of incredibly violent acts which have been justified. But this isn't necessary and is based on an underdeveloped spiritual consciousness. According to the law of life, there can only be unity, and no acts of violence can ever be justified. This is one of the greatest achievements of Tolstoy's moral philosophy. Summary of Chapter 5. Tolstoy describes how the anti-materialism of Christ's message was not the result of an aesthetic, but the result of following internal goals which were driven by universal faith. Tolstoy makes the striking realization that a life dedicated by external materialistic goals is inevitably prone to psychological suffering and meaninglessness, since ultimately such goals are vain and temporary. I wonder to what extent the psychological ills of our society are really the reflection of a stunted spiritual consciousness. The general acceptance of apathy is immediately obvious within our society, and Tolstoy argues that in order to liberate ourselves from such spiritual neglect, we need to open our eyes to the needs of others around us, our neighbours, our citizens, our fellow man. Should we really be surprised, as the benefits of serving others are so obvious to those who dedicate a large part of their lives to raising families? However, emphasising moral cultivation seems irrelevant to how we typically understand our role within liberal democracies. I must emphasise Tolstoy's point that spiritual neglect has knock-on consequences for our civic society, a society which is dominated by individuals who do not actively engage in its improvement, and in some cases, when it benefits themselves, impede improvement. This will inevitably produce a multiplicity of real-world ills and regressions. This is ultimately a socially conservative understanding of civic culture. What Tolstoy calls for is a Christian humanity, the idea that everyone needs to accept the need for spiritual improvement towards universal faith. Complete unity is needed, placing at its heart the fundamental importance of moral cultivation. Gandhi's famous quote emphasises this point, quote, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." End of quote. The next chapter will consider the real-world implications if such an understanding was adopted. Chapter 6. Tolstoy, the Anarchist Thinker. It should go without saying that Tolstoy's writings on moral philosophy demand an alternative vision of how we should live in society today. This alternative vision puts a great demand on the individual to actively participate in bringing about such a change. Tolstoy quotes Jane Kentish, quote, "Religious understanding is based on the commitment to life rather than withdrawal from it, on participation rather than passivity, on establishing the kingdom on earth rather than anticipating it in the afterlife." End of quote. This objective of establishing the kingdom of God on earth brings into sharp focus just how much of our society falls short of this ideal. This project brings into question the status quo and demands that it fits with Christian humanity or is done away with entirely. This is supported by the accounts written in the Gospels. Christ himself was not an aloof sage, but instead he was a relentless advocate for a different moral vision, a revolutionary in the true sense of the word. And like Christ before him, Tolstoy warned against the authority of the state. He argues that governance obscures the individual's ability to cultivate their own religious consciousness. Quote, "Christ founded neither a church nor a state. He handed over no laws, nor government, nor any form of external authority, but he tried to write the law of God in the hearts of man in order that they might govern themselves." End of quote. As he bluntly points out, quote, "The Gospels directly deny the authority of both the church and the state." End of quote. Both of these established authorities have obscured the necessary importance of moral development. As Tolstoy states, quote, "If only instead of this we were taught and confirmed that God is a spirit, the manifestation which dwells within us, and the strength of which increases throughout our lives. One need only teach these ideas, and all that flows quite naturally from these principles." End of quote. However, this hasn't happened, and instead moral degradation has established itself. For Tolstoy, this is evident in many aspects of our society today, which clearly go against the principles of Christian humanity. For instance, any system which is based on disunity and inequality must be abandoned. And again he comes to some very radical conclusions, for instance, objecting to the very concept of private property. It is clear that Tolstoy's moral philosophy equates to an anarchist political project. Indeed, his work is probably the best example of what is called Christian anarchism. The famous anarchist Peter Kropotkin greatly admired his work, especially his book, The Kingdom of God is Within You. Tolstoy himself lays out his anarchist vision. Quote, "To the question of what life would be like without government and authorities, the answer can only be that there certainly would not be all the evil that government creates. There would be no private land ownership, no taxes spent on things unnecessary to the nation, no division of nations, no enslavement by some by others, no more wastage of the nation's best resources on war preparation, no more fear on one hand of the bombs and on the other of the gallows, and there would be none of this senseless luxury of some while still this senseless poverty of others." End of quote. Let's take stock. Tolstoy only outlines this alternative vision as being achievable with a grand evolution in man's spiritual consciousness. This has interesting parallels to Marxism, and it's important to contrast the two. Karl Marx's idea that the state would wither away is in some respects remarkably similar to Tolstoy's moralistic vision. However, what is clear is that the approach is completely different. Revolutionary Marxism requires imposing the authority of a communist state in order to achieve this eventual end. Needless to say, this runs completely contrary to Tolstoy's Revolution in a Religious Awakening. Tolstoy is sympathetic to such political movements, and actually argues that the modern political theories of socialism, communism and anarchism are, quote, really nothing other than partial manifestations of a Christian consciousness in its true sense, end of quote. This is especially the case when such movements try to establish, quote, a reasonable structure based on mutual love and service, end of quote, which is essentially the vision put forward by Christian humanity. However, what is not compatible is dividing society into opposing groups, which is a particular feature of left-wing ideology. Quote, the struggle between the oppressors and the oppressed cannot unite people, but, on the contrary, the further it progresses, the further it divides them. End of quote. The problem with such an outlook is that it necessarily assumes that people with different interests cannot come together out of shared values. It also implies a conflict in which the only outcome is a power struggle in which the victor will force their beliefs and interests on the other. Not only does Tolstoy think this is regressive, but he fundamentally objects to the idea that it is an accurate representation of what drives behaviour, beliefs and ultimately political change. Quote, the leading figures of today, scholars, liberals, socialists, revolutionaries, anarchists, cannot use history or psychology to understand what it is that motivates people. They should be persuaded by what they see, that men are not motivated by material conditions, but only by religion. End of quote. What is needed then is a revolution in religious consciousness, which re-establishes Christ's message as understood in the Gospels, the Christian humanity. Quote, we must enter a new path of existence, and in order for us to do that, we do not need to invent neither a new faith or new scientific theories that might explain the meaning of life and guide it. And, above all, we do not need any particular kind of activity except to free ourselves from the superstition of a false Christianity and political structures alike. End of quote. Summary of Chapter 6. Tolstoy's overall point is that we need to stop trying to create political ideologies which hope to change the world for the better, since we already have a clearly defined revolutionary idea put forward by Christ of establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth and not within the afterlife. Tolstoy's political vision can only be fully realised once a united spiritual awakening has taken place. Every single person must be brought into such a movement. It's pretty obvious to me that such a vision is incredibly unlikely, to say the least. However, it's important to emphasise that this runs completely contrary to how political change is often viewed. Political change is often seen as a power struggle which ultimately divides society into opposing classes and/or identities with their own entrenched interests. According to Tolstoy, this completely ignores the importance of religious faith in determining how someone views their place in society. It stifles political progress by diminishing our ability to recognise the commonality, namely that we are all part of the brotherhood of man. Tolstoy wants people to take seriously the idea of cultivating their morality by acting in accordance with universal faith. This is why he is considered one of the greatest examples of Christian anarchism, the ultimate idea of self-governance. It's principally for this reason why he believes that government and capitalism both encourage moral apathy and harmful disunity. In fact, anything that creates a barrier between people's ability to enact universal faith should be abolished. This ultimately gives a cosmopolitan view of ethics, which essentially means that the needs of humanity are the responsibility of everyone. Overall, in my opinion, Tolstoy was right to champion the message as told in the Gospels, since Christ most certainly laid down the gauntlet in moral philosophy. Therefore, any political vision going forward has to take this into account. And that's the end. I hope you've enjoyed. Leave any comments below. Thanks very much for listening.